Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here amongst you again. Yesterday, we looked at the nature of law. It was something of a sort of expositional, theologic kind of talk. Today is a little different. What we're going to do today is be much more about the nature of character, and in particular, we'll look at compassion. The the pervading thing of Christ is that of love. John tells us in his letter that greater love has no man than he lay down his life for his friends. So love was something that pervaded his life. And love is one of these multifaceted, complex, rich subjects. So I like looking at different aspects of it, and I find compassion really a helpful dimension of love to focus on. And as we look through the gospel accounts, we find again and again how much love pervaded his life. And so what we'll do, how much compassion this dimension of love pervaded his life. So what we'll do is, all being well, dig into some of the incidents in Jesus' life. It's really exciting to explore the backstories of the accounts that we have. It's easy just to read the accounts and not put our minds in the situation. But if we do imagine, like, suppose we were there, what actually is going on? And what are the motivations of the people? How are they feeling? And I think it becomes a rich source of insight. Obviously, you have to be careful because one could make stuff up. But so long as it's approached with caution, I think it can be a rich source of insight. So I'd like to start with an incident in Luke chapter 7. And so we'll be jumping around the Gospels quite a bit, and a number of short passages in the Gospels. So let me read a few verses from Luke 7, starting at verse 11. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. And as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." And then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. So the way Luke tells it, very simple story. But just by digging in a little bit, we can notice some other things about this. This was her second funeral, perhaps a final funeral. She'd already buried her husband. She was a widow. And now her only son, she's burying him. And in that sense, she is now destitute. She has lost in that society the means of any sort of economic survival. She's lost her husband, presumably one that she loves. She's lost her son, presumably one that she loves. And obviously the love that we have for our children is profound and deep and different than the love that we have for our partners. But both of them can be just deep and tremendous. And here she is, lost it. And I love the way that the NIV puts it here in verse 13. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. And this to me really characterizes compassion, where it's like your heart is now feeling someone else's pain. His heart goes out to her. He's in the midst of her experience. And I wonder whether there was something especially poignant here for him. I wonder whether there was a sense for him looking forward that he was seeing a pre-echo of his mother's life. We don't know what happened to Joseph, but Joseph seems to have been out of the picture, perhaps because he had died early on. And then Jesus, her eldest son, is going to be buried as well. And perhaps there's an element of my mother is going to experience this was something that strengthened the sense. Um, and maybe there's another part where he goes in and he brings the son back to life. Maybe there's a sort of message there to Mary when she hears about it, uh, because this is up near Galilee. When she hears about it, that she perhaps Jesus is saying, "Look at this echo. It's going to be in your soon. Not only the funeral, the second funeral, but also the resurrection." And I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but I just love this sense that Jesus is so engrossed in this poor woman's life that he enters into it just fully. Uh, his heart went out to her, and I find that, as I say, a phrase when that really captures the notion of compassion. So when I'm looking to see, am I having compassion in a particular situation? Asking myself the question, is my heart going out to this person? Is a good self-test that I find, as to whether I'm actually feeling compassion or whether I'm staying at a distance. So one of the things I love about the way Jesus does this is that he blends emotion and reason. He's bringing both of these together. He's perhaps thinking ahead, thinking about what's the message that's being said, but he's not doing so in a cold-hearted way. He's doing full of emotion, full of the experience of the moment. He's exercising both heart and mind in all that he does. And there's many other examples of that. Let's look at John 4. You might want to keep your finger in Luke 7 because we'll be bouncing back here. But in John 4, we'll start at that point. He has an official coming to him who has an issue that his son is ill. And so John 4, verse 46. Once more, Jesus visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick in Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. And the royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus replied, You may go. Your son will live. And the man took Jesus at his word and departed. And while he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. And when he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, The fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour. And then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, Your son will live. And so he and all his household believed. So he'd come about a 20-mile journey. I think that's about 30-something kilometers from Capernaum to Cana in order to see Jesus. So this was a long journey. Come and heal my son. And I think verse 48, when Jesus says, unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, you'll never believe. Jesus is in some sense challenging him a little bit. Like, we did a sign here in Cana. You know I have the power. Do you need to see a sign to believe? Can you believe without a sign? I think is the implicit question here. And so when the royal official says, come down before my child dies, Jesus says, essentially, trust me, I've healed him already. Now imagine how this man is in this point. Like, do I need to see a miraculous sign? Do I need Jesus to be there? Do I trust Jesus? Do I believe in the sign that was performed here in Cana just a short while ago? And again, the NIV is great translation. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. But imagine what that journey home was like. It's more than a day's journey. So he's now heading home without Jesus. Has Jesus done what he said? Hasn't he done what he said? I can imagine huge turmoil He gets home, and indeed, Jesus' word was true. And so we get in verse 53, the father realized this was at the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." And so he and all his household believed. So didn't he believe before? And I think he did. He believed before to some extent, but had this linger. Can I really rely on Jesus? And now suddenly, of course I could. Something within me knew that I could rely on Jesus. And now I have the evidence in front of me. My son is alive. And so he believes, he and his household believe entirely. They fully enter into faith. And again, if we think about this through the lens of compassion, what Jesus is doing, he's not only healing the immediate hurt, addressing the immediate need that this man has, but he's doing it in a way that this man will grow in his faith as a result of it. Jesus could easily have walked with him that distance and then come there and then healed the child. But instead, Jesus sees that this man is ready for a challenge. And so his compassion is not only in being able to reach out and heal the child, but it's to reach out and heal the official of his self-doubt, of his doubt in God, of his doubt in Christ. Doubt not in the sense of, does God exist or does Christ exist? Because he could tell Jesus existed, but is God powerful? Can I rely on him? Is Jesus powerful? Can I rely on him? And that is what gets healed as he comes. And so the work of Jesus ends up being much more profound than if he had just gone and done this astonishing sign, this astonishing miracle. He combines it with an extra layer of love. If we go back to that chapter in Luke 7, just prior to the chapter that we were looking at before, we have a situation of a centurion. So this centurion is like many centurions in the Gospels and in the Acts, something of an impressive person. This centurion has a servant. His master values this servant highly. Was sick, was about to die, and so he considers himself not worthy to actually talk to Jesus. So he sends his Jewish friends, some of the elders, to Jesus, and so they come to him. And they say, this man deserves to have you do this. He loves our nation. He's built our synagogue. And so the Jews say, look, come with us, come with us, come with us and heal. And so Jesus goes with them. And on the way, we read that the centurion says, oh, no, Lord, I didn't mean you to have to come. I'm not worthy. This is Luke 7 and verse 6. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I don't deserve you to have you come under my roof. This is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. And I can just imagine how that lands for Jesus. Like, the Jews are not at that position of faith yet. Come with us, come with us. You need to come and see and heal and perhaps touch or whatever. And the centurion says, no, I recognize authority when I see it. I know my own authority. I am under authority of the governor and ultimately Caesar, and then I have people under my authority. I tell them to come, I tell them to go, and I can see that you're similarly. You're under God's authority, and you have authority over the world. So somebody in a position of authority, you just need to say the word. And Jesus naturally at this point now is astonished. I've not seen such great faith even in Israel. And of course, at that moment, though it doesn't quite say it, he must have, as it were, said the word, because the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. And so this act, again, an act of compassion on Jesus' part, that he was willing to come. He was willing to respond to the pleas of the friends of the centurion, to come to the centurion's house. And then Jesus himself being confronted by this incredible moment of faith. I think that must have buoyed his spirit no end. What was exciting about this, I think, from his point of view, is the same lesson he was trying to teach the royal official in John 4, can you believe without a sign? This foreigner, this soldier, already understands. And so this sense of being able to bring compassion to a situation, he doesn't need to teach this centurion anymore about, can you trust in me? Can you rely on me? That man is already there. So another incident I'd like to look at, this one of Bartimaeus. We're going to look at each of the gospel records on this, because as we go through them, we get a little more detail. Luke is actually going to give us quite a compressed account of the healing of Bartimaeus. And this is in Luke 18. Luke 18 and verse 35. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. He called out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Lord, I want to see, he replied. And Jesus said to him, receive your sight, your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. And when all the people saw it, they also praised God. And so here's this man calling out Jesus, and he calls him Son of David, this title of kingship. I recognize your authority. And Jesus comes over to him, and I think here's a key thing that Jesus does again and again. Jesus doesn't presume that he knows what the person wants. He says to him, what do you want? It may be that this person is just wanting money. I need money, or I need a meal, or I need somebody to take care of something. So Jesus isn't presuming. What do you want? And in this case, he says, I want to see. I know that that's reasonable to ask that of you. I want to see. And so Jesus says, receive your sight, your faith has healed you. As I say, this is actually a slightly compressed account. Luke, in writing his gospel, I think has a particular purpose of encapsulating various incidents, even though they may be spread out in time a little more. There's a situation in Luke 4, for example, where he compresses the Capernaum ministry into just like 1 or 2 verses, and then immediately gets on to what goes on in Nazareth when Jesus is nearly thrown down from the cliff, because I think he wants to have it in conjunction with the wilderness. And we'll look at that, the temptations in the wilderness, and we'll have a look at that in a later study. So there are a number of times where Luke compresses in order to simplify the account, in order to give the essence. But if we go back to Matthew, we'll notice a feature of this account that Luke kind of skimmed over, because Luke didn't need it for what he was conveying, which is the power Jesus had to heal and to take care of those who have needs. So in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 29, it says, as Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. Hang on. Luke told us, as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. Whereas Matthew is telling us, as Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him, and 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Whereas previously it was a blind man, back in Luke, was sitting by the roadside begging. And obviously some people might blow this up to say, look, the Bible contradicts itself. I don't think that's the case at all. There's nothing incorrect in Luke's account, and indeed we'll see the resolution of it. But Matthew is giving us a new element. That is, as Jesus and his disciples were coming out of Jericho, this situation with the 2 blind men happened, where he calls out to them, And again, it's verse 32, Jesus stopped and called them, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." So we can actually put it together with what was happening in Luke, that Jesus was coming into Jericho and Bartimaeus was there, and Bartimaeus calls out, calls out, calls out, and Jesus actually walks past him and goes into Jericho and spends the Sabbath weekend there in Jericho. This is when Zacchaeus was healed in the town of Jericho at that point. And then after the Sabbath is over, he comes out, and as he leaves, now this blind man has been joined by a companion. Maybe he got his friend saying, "Look, join me, together we'll make more noise." And they start shouting, and the crowd is rebuking them. And Jesus stops and calls out to them, speaks to them. What do you want? So I find it fascinating that this man, Jesus Christ, who is so loving, so careful, so compassionate, chose to make Bartimaeus wait a weekend before responding. He made him wait over the Sabbath. By the way, in case you're worried that I've read too much into it, when we go to the Mark account, Mark actually gives us a lot of this detail in Mark chapter 10 and verse 46. Then they came to Jericho. They came, that is Luke. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. And Mark has some fascinating details here. So Jesus stopped, and Jesus doesn't go over to him. Of course, Jesus could so easily have gone over to him, and I presume it must be out of a desire for something to go on in this blind man that he stops and stays at a distance and calls out, bring him over, call him. And so they call the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." And then, did you notice this at the start of verse 50? Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. Like, if how would he ever find that cloak again if he didn't get healed? And it's probably his only cloak. A blind man begging at the gate of a city is not going to be able to have many possessions. This might be his only cloak. And yet in this moment, even just this cloak is irrelevant. He throws it away. Of course I'll be able to find it, because I'll be able to see when I come back. And so he throws away his cloak. He throws it aside. Tremendous faith that his blindness will be healed. And then he receives his sight. "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man, "Rabbi, I want to see." And there may be times when in our thoughts and meditations and prayers, we have a sense that God is saying to us, that Jesus is saying to us, "What do you want me to do for you?" And sometimes we are a little weaselly word, "Well, maybe something like this." I mean, Bartimaeus is not like that. He says, "Lord, Rabbi, I want to see." And I think that there are times when we're in prayer that we can be like that with the Lord as well. "Rabbi, this is what I want. I want to tell you what's in my heart. You may choose not to give it to me, but I know that you can give it to me if it's right for me. Here's what's in my heart." And there's a kind of boldness in his prayer, in his request to Jesus at this point. And in this case, your faith has healed you, and Jesus does heal him. He receives his sight. And So many things he could be looking at, so much he could be doing. Nonetheless, at this point, he fixes his eyes on Jesus. Despite everything else that he could do, he's now fixated on following Jesus and going after him. So on this whole dynamic, I love this idea that Jesus, this man of love, this man of compassion, has the beggar wait, has him fetch a friend, develops his faith, and then in that moment heals him. And if he did that with people that were there right in front of him, that's how he'll be working with us, as he works in our lives, as he develops us, as we appeal for things like, no, I need you to wait, or I need you to take time, I need you to bring somebody else, I need something from you, not because he needs it, but because we need it. Here's a lovely incident. Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5 and verse 21. And I suspect that probably everybody, or almost everybody listening to these talks, knows these incidents backwards and forwards. But what I found exciting for the past, I guess probably about 10 years, I've been digging into the Gospels more and more. And at one level, they're just very simple. And yet at another level, they're profound. There's so much richness going on just underneath the surface. And this is one of those incidents. So let's again read a chunk. This is a larger chunk, but I think it's worth reading it. Mark chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. And then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Be freed from your suffering." And while Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. And he put them all out and took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was, and he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. And at this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is a last-minute opportunity for the synagogue ruler. His daughter is literally at the point of death. He's pleading earnestly with Jesus. He worships him. He's got plenty of faith. There's no "if you can," but it's "please come, please come. I need you to come and do this." And so Jesus does, and he's heading towards the house. But on the way, an interruption. This woman with bleeding, she is unclean. And Jesus is totally focused on this whole issue of this woman. And while in the midst of this other thing of going to Jairus's daughter, there's this other incident taking place. I talked in the last study about the sort of Good Samaritan test. Here's Jesus in the midst of the Good Samaritan test. I'm about to do one thing, that my mind is set on one thing, and suddenly there is need here. And the compassion of our Lord is so powerful that he becomes totally focused on the need that is there right in front of him. The aspect of, I felt power go out from me. Who is it? Again, I think seeing this from the lens of love, from the lens of compassion, what he's doing with this woman is he's actually freeing her at this point, not from her bleeding. She's already been freed from that. He's freeing her from her shame. He brings her to confession and faith. And so she is terrified that she was there because she was unclean. But he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Be freed from your suffering. And can you imagine how that would elevate her? Jesus realizes that it's not just the physical that she needs healing for. It's the mental, it's the spiritual. And so in his care and compassion, he reaches out to her and he does what is needed to lift her up, to heal her, to make her whole. What about Jairus? I mean, have you ever thought what Jairus must have been going through at this moment? It was literally time critical that Jesus come and see his daughter. He must have been desperate. Like, why are you stopping to deal with this woman? You need to come with me. You said you would come with me. And then in the midst of that sort of agony of waiting, this agony of the interruption, the worst possible news comes. Your daughter is dead. It's too late. Must have been devastating for him. Like, if only he had ignored this woman, if only he had just come to deal with my daughter. Like, she's old, my daughter's young. But Jesus turns to him and he says, don't be afraid, just believe. There's a really powerful lesson, and we'll explore it more in just a minute. What Jesus is saying to him is that my compassion to another is never at your expense. And so Jairus, beyond all hope, kind of believes, like doesn't know what to hope for, doesn't know what, he thinks it's too late. But Jesus says, believe. I'm willing at least to suspend disbelief. I'm willing to step into this space and see what happens. So he believes beyond all hope. And Jesus goes in with the parents and the disciples. And you can imagine the mix of grief and confusion and anticipation. Talitha kaum. Talitha in Aramaic means little girl. In Hebrew, apparently, it sounds rather like little lamb. I don't know why that gets me, but that always gets me. It's like, little lamb, stand up. Just the presence that Jesus has with people. I mean, what we read in that woman in Nain, the widow in Nain, his heart goes out to her. Like, his heart is going out to them all at this point, one after the other after the other. And he's right in the midst of the healing. But it's interesting to actually stand back and notice some elements about it. There's two lessons that I think are really worth drawing out. The first is that Jairus didn't actually need Jesus to be present to heal his daughter. Jesus had already demonstrated that elsewhere with the royal official's son as the second sign that he had done. And I think this is after that. This is significantly after that. So Jesus has already demonstrated that he is able to heal with a word. But Jairus isn't there in his faith, in his spirit. He's not there yet. So even though theoretically Jairus didn't need Jesus to attend, he wasn't ready just to ask Jesus, say the word and my daughter would be healed. And because his faith was only this big and not this big, it means that he ended up needlessly suffering panic and despair. Jesus could have healed with a word. He could have said, your daughter is well, yeah, you may leave. And Jairus could have gone. And then Jesus could have dealt with the woman and many other things. But Jairus wasn't ready. And I have that sense that's like us in our lives. How much can we believe that Jesus can accomplish as he works in our life? All authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. He is the one who is our high priest, our shepherd. He's the one that directs the forces of heaven to our salvation. And do we believe that he can accomplish things? How much do we want to ask for? How much can we trust? In so many aspects of faith, we're the limiting factor. It's our limitations are the things that limit what Jesus is able to do through the power of God. I remember a long time ago there was this lots of debate within British Christadelphians, particularly young people. What does it mean to be led by the Spirit and have the Spirit of God and so on? And without getting into that debate, obviously that's a huge conversation just in its own right. One element in which we can be led by the Spirit is by taking the Word of God into ourselves and read and absorb it. And I'm not saying that's the entirety of it, but I think everybody would agree at least that is a significant part of being led by the Spirit. How much do you want to be led by the Spirit? You get to choose. How much do you want to read and absorb and dwell on and grow by taking its input? We control the intake. We control how much we allow spiritual things, spiritual ideas, spiritual perspectives to guide and drive our lives. There's a lovely song in the praise book, One Shall Tell Another. The second, I think it's the second verse, starts out, he longs to do much more than our faith has yet allowed. And I love that image, that Jesus is there, and I want to do things in your life. I want to serve you. I want to have you grow in rich, rich ways. And yet, because you're mini faiths, there's only so much that I can do with you. As your faith grows, then I can work more with you. And as your faith grows more, then I can do more with you and helping you grow into the fullness of the spiritual life that he has in mind for each one of us. He longs to do much more than our faith has yet allowed. I love thinking about that incident of the just after the feeding of the 5,000, and the disciples get into the boat and they're rowing into the face of the storm, and then Jesus comes down from the mountain and he walks on the water, and they see him, and they're struggling in the boat, and they see him walking by, and some of them say it's a ghost. No, it's Jesus. And so they call out him, and Jesus says, and Peter says, Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you. Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out of the boat. I mean, have you thought what the other disciples would be doing and saying to Peter at that point? Like, are you mad, Peter? This is crazy. Peter, get back in the boat. Peter, what are you doing? But this moment where Peter sort of is connected with Christ, and he says to him, like, if this is really you behind it, bid me to come to you. And the Lord says, come. And Peter responds, and he gets out of the boat. And all too often, our takeaway from this incident is that Peter was afraid and he saw the wind and the waves and started to sink and called out, and Christ reached out and helped him back into the boat. I think the astounding thing about this incident is that Peter got out of the boat. Like, would you? Would I? But he did. He got out of the boat and he was willing to put his trust in Christ. He longs to do so much more than our faith is yet allowed. In his compassion and his love to us, he says in his heart and his mind, he says to Jairus, I wish you could believe, because then you don't need to go through this whole pain and agony of wondering whether we'll get there in time. But he doesn't believe, not enough. And so he goes through that level of suffering. Jesus wishes, I bet, Jesus wishes that he could have freed him from that. And the second lesson is the one that I said we'd come back to. I think Jairus thought that he had lost out because of Jesus' compassion to the woman. Like, it's too late. We had a window of opportunity, and that window was gone. But in Jairus's case, it clearly was not true. Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe. And there may be times in our life where we suspect that we have lost out because a window of opportunity has closed or something like that. And I think that this principle is still valid. We never lose out because of Jesus' compassion to others. The parable that he tells in Matthew 20 of the workers in the vineyard, those joining the effort late had this unexpected blessing. They got a full day's wages. They had only worked for an hour, and yet they got the wages of the full days. Those who were early, got there early, they had no diminishment of their pay, no averaging of the wages. Like you could imagine the vineyard owner, I think it was a vineyard, I don't recall. The vineyard owner saying, well, because some of you came late and I want to pay you all the same amount, I'm going to have to reduce everybody's wages a bit. No, that didn't happen at all. They all got the full wages. The fact that they complained is another story and not germane to the point that I'm making. The point is, even though Jesus was, or even though the owner of the vineyard was superlatively generous to those that came late, those who came early experienced no loss because of his generation to others. Christ will not shortchange you because of his compassion to others. And I think that to me is this amazing sense of confidence that it gives, that I can rely on his love for me. And his love is unbounded, and his abilities are unbounded. And he's not going to say we've kind of run out of the amount of love we have or the amount of compassion that I have for you. And I think a great practical application of this is when we think about the return of Christ. The return of Christ is perhaps the greatest act of compassion that the world hasn't yet seen. Jesus will come back in order to heal the world. And we pray for it. We continue to pray for it. We are eager. When our minds and our hearts really dwell on it and the reality of it is in front of us, then everything else just evaporates and it doesn't have meaning to us. Other things that we work for, we'd let them go. Except perhaps, what about unbaptized children? And I've talked to young parents who wrestle with this. How can I want the return of Jesus while my children are unbaptized? Like, what will happen to them? Maybe they'll get caught up in the judgments of the world and be lost. And I think this same principle that we've been talking about, we will never lose out because of Jesus' compassion to others, applies here. God is a father. He knows about children. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11, it talks about he will gently lead those who are with young. And I love that sense that when we have the young, God knows about it, and he's especially careful to those of us who have young with us. Now, few specific details are given. I don't know the mechanism. I think anybody who claims to know the mechanism is they're going beyond what I've been able to discover in Scripture. But here's where my confidence is. I will rejoice at the wisdom of the path that he brings about, that he shows. I don't know exactly of our unbaptized children, but he will take care of them. I know that. His compassion to the world will not be at the expense of our children. And I think that's a way that we can gain confidence, and that it removes that fear that, I want the return of Christ, but then I'm scared about the impact on this other person. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. Just believe. Like, whatever happens is something that when we experience it, when we see it, we will be overawed at the wisdom and the love of and the compassion that is shown and that is demonstrated. So I find these two incredibly powerful lessons from this simple incident, that he longs to do much more than our faith has yet allowed, and we can be confident that we never lose out because of his compassion to others. So I'd like us to talk just a little bit about some principles of compassion. So the first is that there's a reason why there is pain and suffering in this world. And I think the primary reason is for us to grow in compassion to one another. When we experience somebody else in need or in hurt, whether physical hurt or emotional hurt, it's the opportunity for our heart to go out to them. It's the opportunity for compassion to go out to them. So someone else's hurt is my opportunity to develop deep compassion for them, and thereby to grow to become more like Christ. I think it's really important to distinguish compassion from its near neighbor, pity. Pity has an element of distance, looking down on, whereas compassion is there in the midst. Compassion is this fundamental expression of love, feeling with, compassion. The com is with, and passion is the feeling. It's the feeling with the person, as opposed to looking at that person at a distance and feeling sorry for them, but not in any sense engaged in their experience. Again, I go back to the widow of Nain. Jesus' heart went out to her. He didn't stand at a distance and think, oh, that's so sad. She's lost her son, and she's a widow as well. That's really sad. His heart went out to her, and he felt with her. He was feeling her pain. And so someone else's hurt is an opportunity for us to experience their pain too, to sit with them, maybe in silence, but just so that they know that they're not alone, and an opportunity for us to develop deep compassion. And this is true of Jesus. We ask of him, and his heart is still stirred. It's not different now that he's at the right hand of the throne of grace. It's not different now that he's in heaven. In Hebrews chapter 4, it's quite clear that Jesus is the same Jesus in terms of his emotional response, in terms of the love and the compassion that he shows, that he was on earth. Verse 15 of Hebrews 4, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And there are times where Jesus demands that we come in front of him, like the woman with the bleeding. And who was it? I need to know who it was. And eventually we come to him and we say, it was me, Lord. I needed it. And the writer to the Hebrews is encouraging us, let's approach the throne of grace with confidence. We don't need to approach it with shame. His heart is still stirred. He knows our true needs. He leads us step by step into life if we let him. The second principle, that his compassion to others is never at our expense. And this third one, I've just been talking to me, they're talking to confidence in his continued compassion for us. These are three, I think, very deep principles of compassion that are worth remembering again and again as we have Jesus work in our lives, as we have him guiding the angels, drawing us to salvation. I'd like to close with a personal reflection. There's a group of activities internationally that take place every now and again called Prepare to Preach, and I've been involved in it for a number of years. And our brother John Popel has produced the Gospel of Peace, he calls it, which is a body of material that is great for helping people just explore the Bible and realize what the Bible is saying. So it's not so much that we're teaching, it's that here's a set of passages. What does this passage mean? What does this passage mean? And you just go through and you read it. And what did I take from this passage? What did I take from this passage? So it's a set of readings and reflection. And at the end of the Gospel of Peace booklet, tutorial, I guess, guided readings, it ends with an opportunity to say, what have you now come to see? What is your faith? What is your personal statement of faith? And often we think of the statement of faith as a creedal formulation, and that's indeed what we have as a community. We call it the statement of faith. It's actually a statement of doctrine, or a statement of dogma. In sociology, the word that is used for that kind of thing is facticity. It's our statement of facticity about these are the facts as we understand them. But faith is much more about, what do I trust? What is it about what I've learned that has me want to come to God? And so I decided that I wanted to embody my faiths, my beliefs, my reliances in a personal poem. And it reflects some of what we've been talking about. It's in 4 slides that we'll run through. And it will be a closing devotion on this talk. So we'll go through it relatively slowly, but let your minds be quiet and focused, and dwell on it, and maybe it finds resonance for you as well. So here we go. Here I am today, probably tomorrow too. But already I feel death in my body, and one day I'll be gone. Grief, mortal, irrelevant. I have no power to change this. How other is eternal love, everlasting in being, force and direction of the universe. My Father. I know him through the one who calls me brother. He shows me my Father. Because of my brother, I reject fear, whether manifested as hate or anger or loneliness. I choose the binding power of love instead. Love for my father, love for my brother, and love for you too. My brother is helping myself to die, so that the life of my father can be unrestrained within me. He is very patient. Thank you.